Okay, time to get started. Welcome, everybody. This is our fifth linguistics research seminar. So the second to last one. Time flies when you're having fun. And our speaker for today, our very own Leigh, unfortunately, was a victim of the ongoing train strikes. All the trains were cancelled, so she couldn't come. But thank goodness for technology. We had planned to bring back dual delivery anyway, so we can make use of it right away because Leigh will be speaking to us digitally. Leigh got her PhD in 2019 from the University of Nottingham and then did a postdoc at Aston University in Birmingham before she joined our department this September. She is interested in critical discourse analysis, communication of poverty and destitution, and in particular, communication of debt collection using corpus-based methodologies. And also from Manchet, I learned that she is interested in all sorts of sports. She even coaches a football team and also volunteers in a soup kitchen. So not only a great academic, but also very likable and a great colleague. I'm very happy she's here with us. And today she will be speaking on Heat or Eat, Public Discourses of Food and Fuel Poverty from 2017 to the present day. So Leigh, the virtual floor is all yours.
Lovely, thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining online and for being there in the room. So this is just a really good opportunity for me to present and have a bit of time to present some of my research interests and some of the things that I've been working on recently. For those of you who don't know, my background is in pragmatics and discourse analysis, but I'm really interested, as Richard has said, in sort of the relationship between language and social justice especially. So that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today in the form of discourses around food poverty and fuel poverty over the past 5 years or so. So what I want to cover today is just give you an overview of the two projects that I'm carrying out, and I'm going to focus specifically on food poverty today over the period of the last 5 years. I'd like to cover some existing research on food poverty, introduce the FoodPov corpus, which we've collected, and then some initial findings regarding some of the main actors in food poverty and some intersections of different forms of food poverty, especially fuel poverty. Sorry, food poverty and fuel poverty are very similar, I'm afraid, sound the same, so different intersections of different forms of poverty in the data as well. Unfortunately, these are not very pleasant topics. They're something that I would rather not be researching. So just to try and lighten the mood a bit, here's me with some oversized vegetables and blocks of cheese. As Richard said, I've been volunteering at a food bank for the past couple of years, and this is kind of really how I've come about this topic. And I think it's because I've been in this sort of arena and been listening to people and how people talk about food poverty, and I think there's been a general sort of shift in the public discourse about people who use these type of services over the past couple of years. And that's certainly maybe not been a direct result of COVID, but has sort of taken place over that period of time. So that's kind of how I've come about this topic. And as a consequence, I'm really focusing on this phrase heat or eat, which is something that you're probably familiar with in some form. And this points sort of to the decision that people have to make between two sort of basic fundamentals on not having access to either food or to fuel. So basically what I've been doing is I've been running two pilot projects in parallel, so one on food poverty, one on fuel poverty, and these are very broadly wanting to investigate how each of these are represented in pre-COVID corpus and a since COVID corpus, which I'll explain a little bit more detail in a moment. I've been really fortunate that both of these projects have been funded. So the food poverty project's been funded by the UK Research and Innovation grant, and then I'm in the process of getting the fuel poverty research network grant moved over to Manchester. And the intention here really is, once both of these are completed, is to combine them and start to generate some understanding of public discourses of destitution. So that's when people are experiencing multiple forms of poverty at once. Today, I'm just going to talk about food poverty, and that's because this project is much further on than the fuel poverty project, but also because, as I'm sure you're aware, the sort of situation with the price of fuel and the cost of living is changing so drastically with regard to fuel that I've sort of halted my data collection with that until I've got all my resources moved across to Manchester. I just want to thank, at this point, Kevin and Maria, who are PhD students at Lancaster, have done an unbelievable job helping me with this, especially with collecting the corpus and conducting some initial analysis. So, yeah, I'm presenting here today, but they've done so much of the legwork, so I really can't thank them enough. Okay, so the first thing I really want to address is what exactly food poverty is, and this is because it's often used interchangeably with other terms in the media and in general sort of everyday language use. And what you tend to find is that food poverty, food security and food insecurity are used interchangeably. So I just want to talk about each of these. Now, each of these have three things in common. The first of which is the amount of food that people are able to access. So whether they're able to access enough food for an active, healthy lifestyle. The second thing regards the quality of the food that they're able to access. So is that nutritionally adequate food and safe food? And the third thing concerns the means of access. So what we mean by this is how people are able to acquire enough healthy food, and if that's in a socially acceptable way. And what we mean by that is particularly without people having to resort to emergency food supplies. Talking about emergency food supplies, the picture of food poverty in the UK tends to be focalised through food bank usage. Now, this tends to be the main lens, but it's only part of the picture. So it's not the only form of emergency food support available in the UK. For instance, there are community kitchens, yeah, statistics on food poverty tends to be focalised through food bank usage. So just to give you a bit of an overview, in 2000, there was only one food bank in operation in the UK. And last year, so for the year 2021 to 2022, the Trussell Trust, which is the largest network of food banks in the UK, delivered 2.1 million emergency food parcels. So you'll see that there's a little bit of a dip in 2021, 2022, after sort of the high of 2020, 2021. But you can see that overall there's a long-term upward trend in the use of emergency food supplies. Since 2016, certainly, it's been particularly severe, and that amounts to an 81% increase for the Trussell Trust in terms of the distribution of their parcels. I think a really nice way of kind of summarising where we're at is in August of this year, Iceland started issuing food loans. So they were giving up to £75 of interest-free loans for people to afford to buy their weekly shop. I won't comment on the ethics of that, but it's just in where we're at with supermarkets getting involved. We've got basically the long-term upward trend in terms of emergency food supplies, and I just want to point out that it's probably not a surprise to you to know that the demand for these services coincides with economic factors, so whether that's local or global. So one of the major changes here has been attempts to weaken the social security system in the UK, and most recently there's been uplifts on universal credit that's been stopped of October last year. I won't talk about the most recent statement changes in the past couple of months because that's particularly chaotic, but certainly in spring of this year benefits were not brought in line with the true cost of living, and I'm sure that we're all aware that there is obviously quite an increasingly worsening situation with inflation as well. So food poverty is in response to and reflects the broader economic context more broadly speaking. So given that, I'm focusing on public discourses of poverty, and I'm mainly wanting to do this just by starting with UK newspapers, so focalising this through UK newspapers. I know this is a very established way of doing things, sort of using linguistic techniques to look at social issues and their representation in newspaper discourse. But for a pilot study, I think this is perhaps a bit of a crude but a really interesting way into the data. One of the things to point out about print-based newspapers is obviously that they're on the decline. So there are some debates in the research about the relevance of newspaper research, but there's a counter-argument to that, which is that the increasing reach of online versions of material maintains newspapers' relevance as well. And because of the general proliferation of different platforms of information, but also disinformation as well, that this is still an interesting data set to pursue. So overall, really, the significance of looking at public discourses of poverty through UK newspapers, or at least starting with this, is owing to the long-term or the potential long-term effect of media on audiences, particularly when people are subjected to repeated conceptualisations of images of social phenomenon. And that's what Gerbner said back in 1986, and slightly more recently, although it's still 20 years ago, Seal in 2003 argued that newspapers are a chief source of information for society itself, information about society, but also its values, so what counts as a norm or a transgression, and has fundamentally the power to shape not only people's beliefs, but also their actions at individual and population level as well. The prime example of this for me is sort of the discourses surrounding migrants and how that can change people's both beliefs and actions as well. Okay, so it might not surprise you to know that there is existing research out there on food poverty in UK newspapers from other disciplines, and I'd just like to focus on that. That's come from social policy, politics and public health. So what we tend to find in this research is that they focus on the amount of coverage of food poverty as a newsworthy topic, okay? So how often it's reported on. So unsurprisingly, what this research points to is that pre-2008, there were no articles in national newspapers on food banks, and that actually the general reporting on poverty, more generally speaking, not specifically in relation to food poverty, was really peripheral. And then unsurprisingly, over time, we see an increase in this between 2008 and 2012, and then an exponential increase from 2012 onwards. So there's the amount of coverage, and there's also the period of coverage as well. And what I've found is that this research tends to sort of span 2008, either side of 2008. And the most recent data set seems to go up to 2019. So basically, there doesn't seem to be anything that's intentionally covering a period before COVID and since COVID, which is, I'll go on to explain in a bit what I'm looking to do. Okay, so just to pull out some findings from this research from other disciplines, is that they tend to make quite highly thematic, observable, pick out observable trends in this data. So things like left-leaning papers typically have more coverage of food poverty than right-leaning papers. Initially, when they're first reported on, food banks are represented as shocking and exotic phenomenon that need to be explained, but unsurprisingly, over time, they become increasingly normalised. And that these newspapers tend to focus on both the solutions to food poverty and the drivers of food poverty. So whether that's structural drivers and solutions, whether it's individual responsibility and solutions, or the interventions of charities. And finally, one of the things that they like to point out is the absence of food bank users' voices. Okay, so it's very often people, spokespeople, speaking on behalf of people who use their services. So overall, this research tends to point towards a generally more sympathetic approach or perception of food poverty than poverty more generally speaking in UK newspapers. Okay, so that's research from other disciplines, and what we find is that there is research from linguistics on poverty more generally speaking. So this isn't specifically on food poverty. It's generally more poverty more broadly speaking, but especially in relation to people who are on receipts of benefits. So just to exemplify, this research tends to focus on the public's responses to things like poverty porn, which is highly mediatised or sensationalised, constructions of poverty where, for instance, a camera crew maybe goes into a household of a really extreme example of people exploiting the benefit system. And the data sources tend to be Twitter and focus groups and looking at linguistic constructions of responses to poverty in that sense. And then we also get some research that looks at newspaper discourse, specifically in relation to things like the welfare state. So looking at one particular publication over a period of time. And one thing that I think is really interesting is what's called electronic supplement analysis, which is the comparison of articles themselves to the below the line comments using corpus techniques, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, well, at the end of the presentation, because I think it's something you'll be really interested to do with this data. Overall, then, this research from linguistics tends to point to discourses of poverty in terms of neoliberal evaluations of the poor. So what I mean by that is people are positioned as ideal and scrounging off the state if they're experiencing poverty, they're therefore morally inadequate, and it's a result of their individual failings. Okay, so it overall eclipses some of the structural issues that underlie this. The second thing is that this points towards what we call flawed consumerism. So poverty is a result of people's inability to prioritise their finances and to pay for things in terms of priority order. So there's the stereotype that people will pay for the Sky bill over paying for their bills, their essential bills, their utility bills. And then at the extreme end, what we get is actually denial of poverty being a thing in the UK. So that's a really extreme example of the discourse. So overall, then, this research on linguistic investigations of poverty points towards this dichotomy between sort of state and individual responsibility, and the idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor. And what I mean by that is that the deserving poor are people who are worthy of support, who are worthy of state support, especially. Okay, so given all that research, what I wanted to do was go away and collect some newspaper coverage of food poverty specifically, for a period that spans pre-COVID and post-COVID. So we've gone away and collected a data set that totals up to 2.1 million words and covers basically 2.5 years, from August 2017 up to February 2020. So acting sort of a 2.5 year point before the first lockdown in this country, and then also a 2.5 year point after that first lockdown, so from March 2020 to August of this year. So we've had a look on Nexus UK, we've looked at both online and print newspapers, and we've looked for articles that have at least 3 mentions of food bank, food aid, food poverty or food insecurity. And what we've ended up with is a span of over 27 UK newspapers which cover both national, regional and also, local level, different political leanings and broadsheets and tabloids as well. This is intentionally a really eclectic data set. We wanted this to be as broad a representation of UK newspaper coverage of this issue as possible. And I just want to again thank Kevin at Lancaster for helping me with the data collection, because he's done an unbelievable job of this. This is just an example of the breakdown of the corpus. So you can see in the pie chart there that all the segments in blue are the number of articles from that pre-COVID corpus. The ones in sort of reddy orange are the post, since COVID corpus, and the green are ones that span both of those subcorpora. So those collected from February and before February 2020 and since March 2020. I won't go into the breakdown of the different types of newspapers, but you can see there that there's a mixture of online and print, local, regional and national, and leftish, roughly speaking, leaning centre-ish and rightish leaning political leanings. Okay, so given all this existing research and the data that we've collected, the overarching research questions that I want to look at are: how are the main actors in food poverty in UK food poverty represented in UK newspapers, and does this change over time? And to what extent do UK newspapers recognise the complex intersections of different forms of poverty, especially looking forward to the Fuel Poverty Project, which is an equivalent of this? So specifically today, I just want to focus on 2 main actors. So I'm going to look at those experiencing food poverty and the government. And I particularly want to focus on these given that existing research highlights food poverty and poverty more generally in terms of the deserving and the undeserving poor, and the individual and state responsibility dichotomy. So I want to explore what inactions and actions do they take, what processes are they part of, and what are they impacted by. And then I'd like to, towards the end, just introduce some preliminary findings about the intersections of different poverties in the corpus. So the third main actor in this is the third parties, so charities and food banks themselves, but I've unfortunately not got time to cover that today. So just to give you an overview of the methods, obviously with the size of the data that we're working with, we're using corpus-assisted discourse analysis, and to get an overview of the data and the kinds of themes in the data, Maria's very kindly used some W matrix tagging, semantic tagging, which has been really helpful, and conducted some keyword analysis. And then we've also used Sketch Engine and Lanxbox for some collocation analysis. So we've gone away and looked at collocations of these main actors. And I don't know if anyone has used Sketch Engine before, but it's incredibly helpful for this, for bringing into relief different grammatical patterns and especially formulaic language in newspapers. So that's really helpful if no one's come across that before. Okay. In terms of the two main actors, those experiencing food poverty in the government, the first thing that we needed to do was just identify what reference we were going to use for searching the corpus, and we wanted to adopt a bit of a two-pronged approach to this, so a bottom-down approach and a top-up one. We wanted to combine these because we didn't want to make any assumptions about the data and how it refers to and deals with these main actors. So Maria went away and did some W matrix semantic tagging of the corpora, and then I did some manual reading of the articles, so one publication, one per publication in both the subcorpora, so that was about 40 articles. So just to give you an insight into the sort of reference that I came across for those experiencing food poverty, there was a lot, and it was actually a really quite inclusive set. These are ordered in terms of the most frequent, so people was the most frequent, and likewise for government. And what we found is that when we mapped these onto those that were identified by the W matrix tagging, is that they were very, very similar. So what we've got here on the left-hand column is all the semantic categories for the pre-COVID corpus, and then on the right-hand side for the since COVID corpus. And the ones in blue and greens are the ones that we thought would be most interesting for us. So we've got personal names, people, government, and groups and affiliation. The ones that are in orange there, I think, are ones that we would love to explore in a little bit more detail, because they'd be very interesting in reference to food poverty and how that comes about and what drives it and what solutions there are. So just sort of to foreground those taggings. For people, the most frequent reference, unsurprisingly, was people. For government, it was government. And then we found some really interesting other reference within the groups and affiliations and helping categories as well, especially with regards to third parties. Basically, what we've ended up doing, just in order to give us a really broad way into the data and to give us a good overview, is looking at collocates of people for those experiencing food poverty, and for government for the government. So specifically, again, thinking about what actions or inactions do they take, what processes are they part of or influenced by, and hoping, adopting this approach in the hope that's going to help us get a grasp of this dichotomy between the deserved and the undeserving poor, and individual and state responsibility. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through some of the results. So I'm going to start with people pre-COVID, and what I've done is basically grouped the different collocates according to the themes that seem to come through. So for example, one of the main themes of the collocates of people pre-COVID was quantifications. So quantifications of people needing emergency food services and how those numbers are growing over time. So for example, Trussell Trust warned yesterday that more people than ever are now being forced to go to food banks. So there's quantifications is the first one. The second one is actually different reference to different groups of people, so different social groups. And what comes through here is that food poverty doesn't seem to discriminate. So we've got young and old, we've got elderly and single people, and we've also got a subset of social groups which we might consider to be more vulnerable anyway, so people perhaps who are disabled and homeless. And the third main category I want to point out is I've labelled this susceptibility, because I think what came through in these collocates was the idea that despite their best efforts, especially despite people being in work, ordinary, decent, good, local and working people are experiencing food poverty. This is an example for me of how food poverty is not about flawed consumerism. Okay, so these people are not managing their money poorly, they are going about their business as everyone should, and it's being forced upon them, if that makes sense. And I think actually the idea of working people is really interesting as well. So just to build on that in some more themes from people pre-COVID, we have, unsurprisingly, descriptions of people's personal circumstances, so people being hungry, desperate and destitute. And there's an example from the data. And then building on that, really, we have the theme that exemplifies people's dependency on emergency food supply. So people are reliant and depend upon this support, and they're unable to afford these necessities themselves. And a little bit further on from that, then, we've also got a series of collocations that refer to the services that are received or required by people using emergency food services, so that they need support and they need to be protected from the onset of food poverty. But what I'd really like to focus on here is passivity. What I've found is the repeated use of verbs in which people experiencing food poverty are being subjected to this against their will, so they are not agentive in this process. So people are forced into this, they are driven into this, they are pushed into this, they are being hit or faced with it, and they are being affected by it. So there's a lack of agency in there. And what we do find with the only agentive examples from this data is people having to make a last resort. Okay, so if people are doing things of their own accord, they're having to resort to food banks, they're having to turn to food banks in that example there. And when we look at feel, what we find is more often than not when people are referring to different social stigmas surrounding using emergency food supplies. So people experiencing shame and feeling embarrassed about using these services. Okay, so just to summarise, people for pre-COVID, then we have food poverty is already pervasive. It's impacting multiple people, diverse social groups. There's evidence of dependency and a lack of agency, and reports of feeling shame and embarrassment for using these services. So what about in SINS then? So again, looking at people, but in the SINS COVID corpus, you won't be surprised to see that a lot of these are very similar. So we get the same sort of quantifications of people needing emergency food supplies, but what we get now is a few more additions of collocations that demonstrate the more extreme circumstances here. So we've got thousands previously, we've now got millions in the SINS COVID corpus, and we've also got new people joining the already swelling numbers of people unable to afford to eat, which I think is really interesting because the concept's called the new poor, people who have maybe previously not experienced poverty being pulled into poverty in recent years. We've also got similar groups of people as well, and this has now been expanded to include the self-employed. And for the theme of susceptibility, this is broadened out a little bit more as well. So we've got more references to hard-working and working-age people, but also to the generosity of the general public who are willing to help in poverty. Okay, so moving on to some more themes for people since COVID. Again, we get descriptions of people's personal circumstances, that they're struggling, they're still desperate and destitute. We get the same dependency of emergency food supplies and the same services supplied by food banks, for instance. But we get a little bit of a more extreme discourse in terms of the passivity of those experiencing food poverty. So we get people still being pushed and forced into these positions, but now also we get the addition of terms like trapped, which seem to exacerbate this situation. I'd just like to focus for a second on the agentive processes here, because in this pre-COVID corpus we had turn and feel and tell, but in the since COVID corpus we also get ask and report, and I'd just like to focus on these a wee bit more. So tell, ask and support are agentive, so these are processes that verbal processes that people are undertaking of their own accord, and they're not being channeled through spokespeople, for instance, as they typically are in the pre-COVID corpus. But what we find is, even though these are agentive, what we have is people are reporting their intersections to other forms of poverty. Okay, so people are reporting of their own accord, but they're reporting going hungry during the first lockdown, or people are reporting skipping meals. And then similarly for ask, what we get is people asking for emergency food supplies that can be eaten cold, so that they don't need to be cooked because they can't afford to heat their meals and to cook their meals properly. And then lastly, for telling, again, an agentive process, a verbal process there, is people are telling us, and that's very often spokespeople or charities, that they can't afford to put the heating on, and people are telling us that they're having to make impossible decisions between heating and eating. And that comes back to the sort of overriding purpose of this project, which is to look at those that decisions to heat and eat. So the last thing that I want to finish on for people in both the corpora is just to look at possessives. I don't want to talk about this in too much detail, but I think it gives quite an interesting overview of the kinds of things and how widespread food poverty is, and maybe what aspects of people's life it seems to impact pre-COVID and since COVID. So pre-COVID, we've got people's lives and people's generosity, but since COVID, we've got people's lives, their incomes, their health, their homes, their wages, and their generosity. Just to pull that together then, people either side of COVID, we've got it already been pervasive in pre-COVID, impacting multiple social groups, evidence of dependency, lack of agency, and reports of shame. And since COVID, we've got poverty in growing numbers, including the new poor, affecting more working age people, perhaps evidence of a more extreme discourse. And although those experiencing food poverty's voices is more visible, unfortunately, those agentive processes are reporting intersections to different forms of poverty and potentially a more wider sort of multi-dimensional impact of food poverty since COVID. So that's the main findings so far on people. And I'd just like to do the same by turning to government now as a contrast. So we've done exactly the same thing. We've looked at the collocates and we've tried to theme them according to what's coming through in the data. And the first thing that we notice in the pre-COVID corpus with regards to government is the direct attributions of the government actions for causing food poverty. So if we focus on policies specifically, these are variously described as mean-spirited, cruel, punitive, and attract attention towards the human consequences of austerity. So, for instance, the government's mean-spirited welfare policies has brought the situation to crisis point, and interestingly, measures actually points towards the lack of measures. So it's either policies that are in place that are punitive or measures that are not in place. For instance, in the quote on the slide there, to track food insecurity. So we've got government actions directly contributing to food poverty, and then we've also got collocates that directly point to the government inaction, specifically, or inadequate action as being responsible for this. So in places, these government actions have failed to do what they've said that they're going to do, so to recognise and respond to the issues of hunger. And then we got also overt criticism of these policies or lack of action as well. Okay, and I think what actually happens here is really nicely summarised by the theme in red, which is those collocates that seem to incite the government into action. So what they're doing is either wrong or doesn't seem to work, and therefore it requires a change. What we find is that multiple parties are urging or inciting the government into action. So the government needs to do this. They need to appoint a minister for hunger, and they are directly demanding or asking for these changes. So in terms of who urges, it tends to be charities such as the Trussell Trust and other food foundations, but also in places MPs and spokespeople as well. So these are the people who are carrying out these verbal processes towards the government. Just to summarise there then, government actions are directly attributed to food poverty and overtly criticised. There seems to be a theme of government inaction or inadequate action, and as a consequence of that, the need to incite government action by third parties. What about in since COVID? So we're looking at the since COVID corpus and the collocates of government. So again, quite similar. We've got direct attributions of these actions causing food poverty, particularly in relation to decisions, especially over the past 12 years. And a new theme in the since COVID corpus is those referring to school meals. And this is, I think this was last year actually, I'm losing track of years in COVID, but this is specifically in relation to the actions of Marcus Rashford. So initially what we have is the government refusing to extend school meals in the school holidays, And then we have the processes that are in response to that. So people attempting to persuade or lobby for the opposite, and ultimately, therefore, these public figures forcing the government to perform U-turns on that. So again, we have references to government inaction and inadequate action. And there's a little bit more extreme in the since COVID corpus, because we have references to shame and how this process or this inaction is shameful. And again, we have repeated incitements to get the government to act appropriately. So similar verbs: urge, need, ask, want, but we also get the introduction in the since COVID corpus of the need to act responsibly, or this government's responsibility to do this, and to act with compassion. So a little bit of a more intense version of that. And the last thing to point out about government since COVID is that there seems to be more of a presence of the government attempting either not necessarily to defend, but to counter their own position or to provide a response to this criticism and this incitement into action. And we find this through provide, say, and insist. So we now do evidence that the government is insisting that they are acting appropriately, or that they say that they have acted in a way to counter or to prevent food poverty. So I'd just like to point out, actually, lastly, that in terms of inciting government action, in the since COVID corpus, what we get is a slightly broader pool of people doing this incitement. So we have, in pre-COVID, we had charities, the Trussell Trust, foundations and spokespeople. But in the since COVID corpus, we now also get Tory MPs, so from within the party themselves, and more visibly public figures doing this, such as Marcus Rashford himself. But to pull that together then, we've got the government being overtly criticised, inactive, and being incited to action in the pre-COVID corpus. And then the since COVID corpus, we get similar themes of overt criticism, and actually, in a more extreme sense, the government only acting or fulfilling their responsibilities when overtly being forced or persuaded by the public and public figures and campaigns to do so, and an increasing pool of third parties that are attempting to change the government's actions. And lastly, some evidence of the government's attempts to defend or to respond to this criticism. I just want to pull those findings together in a very sort of preliminary way, in terms of these are the two main actors in terms of food poverty in the UK. How are they construed? What actions are they involved in? How are they impacted? And just from these initial collocations, which I admit is, a crude way of having gone about this, but overall, I hope you can see and you can appreciate that there's themes here of the government as being a driver for food poverty, the government's actions or inactions pushing people into poverty, and ordinary people sort of beyond being forced and pulled into food poverty by processes and systems beyond their own control. And interestingly, I think that points to what I mentioned at the beginning, which was the idea of the undeserving and the deserving poor, and the fact that people seem to be pulled in and positions them as the deserving poor. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of pre and since COVID text? How does this change over time? Well, I've demonstrated that consistently government actions and inactions are directly attributed to food poverty and are overtly criticised in both the corpora. But we see that there's perhaps some incitement to action is a little bit stronger in since COVID, and certainly that the government only seems to act by fulfilling their responsibilities when they're forced to by public figures and campaigns. So overall, then we might say that the discourse around food poverty is a little bit more extreme. It's affecting more social groups since COVID, including the new poor, so people who haven't experienced this before. So that's just really what I wanted to pull together in terms of actors, and just looking forward now to intersections of different forms of poverty. There's lots more that can be done in terms of actors, but I just wanted to give you an insight into the kind of preliminary findings for the intersections of different types of poverty. So what we've got here is a series of different terms that are relevant to fuel poverty, which is obviously the parallel project to this one, and their use normalised per million words in the pre-COVID corpus, which is in blue, and in the since COVID corpus, which is in orange. So what you'll find in most cases for fuel, energy, gas, electricity, destitution, which is destitution and destitute. Cost of living in crisis is that they are, when they're normalised, used much more frequently in the since COVID corpus than in the pre-COVID corpus. So that's a bit of a crude overview of the data, but I hope you can see that that points towards perhaps how these different forms of poverty intersect in the two different data sets. And to kind of exemplify that, on this slide, we've got the modifiers of crisis and poverty in both subcorpora. So we've got pre-COVID and since COVID for both of them. And those in green relate to food poverty. Those in red relate to fuel poverty. And then those in blue in the since COVID sections there are ones that are new. Okay, so they're ones that are not seen in the pre-COVID corpus but have appeared for the first time in the since COVID corpus. So we can see how the scale of poverty and the modifiers of poverty and of crisis are broadening over time. That's a little bit of a crude way of looking at that data and introducing that data. So I'd just like to exemplify how this can maybe be more subtly encoded linguistically through the verb turn. So turn appears in both corpora, both subcorpora. So we've got the pre-COVID on the left here and the since COVID on the right. I'm just going to give you a few examples of the prepositional phrases or the verb phrases in which turn appears. So pre-COVID and since COVID both have examples of turning to, so people turning to food banks in both time periods. We get in both corpora people turning up, so volunteers turning up to food banks or families turning up to pick up free school meal bags. We get turning upside down, so people experiencing really significant changes in their lives, irreversible changes in some cases. And we get turn around, so we get people reaching sort of a juncture in their lives or the opportunity to change. And in each of these examples for turning here, these are used in very, very similar ways in both corpora. But there are ways in which turn is used differently in both subcorpora. So, for example, in pre-COVID, when we find examples of turn away, that's primarily in reference to sort of the moral imperative that people are not turned away from emergency food services. In the since COVID corpus, what we get is that people are being turned away because the demand is too high. So for the first time in years, volunteers at food banks have to turn people away. Similarly, we have the example of turn off. So in pre-COVID, what we have is a few examples of turning heat off, but these are very often used in reference to recipes. So you might have an article about food poverty or about food, and then an example of a recipe for maybe a budget meal. However, in since COVID, references to turn off are they're referring to other appliances in the home. So it's not about only about being food poor, but the inability to have essential appliances like fridges, heating, oven, and even water supplies on as well. So turn off doesn't mean anything in pre-COVID, but in since COVID, it's referring to the intersections of different forms of poverty here. And then the last example that I have is turn down. So in pre-COVID, what we're seeing to find is people turning down things like promotions at work, or people who are in receipt of emergency food supplies, maybe turning down some of more expensive foods because they believe other people might be able to make use of them or maybe need those supplies more. However, in since COVID, what we get is people declining emergency food supplies full stop because they can't afford to cook. So people not being able to afford to heat potatoes and root vegetables, so they're turning down emergency food supplies. So I know that was a very brief overview of sort of evidence of intersections of different forms of poverty. But just to sort of pin those down, and what we can see from that is a greater presence of different intersections of poverty since COVID. So there's more modifiers of crisis, there's more modifiers of poverty, and we therefore see this presence of different forms of poverty in those who are experiencing poverty's voices. So we look back to those sort of verbal processes in the since COVID corpus of report, tell, and I can't remember what the other one was, say possibly. We get ostensibly more overt references to different forms of poverty, so we can look at raw frequencies of different terms, but we can also have highlighted a need to have an awareness of the more subtle encoding of this intersectionality and how this might be more severe over time through verbs and prepositional phrases and verb phrases like turn. So that's obviously a very, very broad overview of the research so far. And the next step, really, the natural next step is to do the same thing with the fuel poverty data in parallel. And ultimately, as I mentioned at the beginning, the intention is to integrate these to have a greater understanding of discourses of destitution. So not just of food poverty and fuel poverty as separate beings, but how these might inform each other and other different forms of poverty that we've maybe not explicitly included as well. Obviously, this is just an example of a form of public discourse on food and fuel poverty is through UK newspapers. But there's a couple of other things that I'd really like to do at some point in the future. And the first of which I mentioned a while ago is the idea of electronic supplement analysis. And this is basically the methodology of comparing institutionally produced texts like newspaper articles to the response comments, to the comment sections from the heterogeneous public, and it gives us a really interesting grasp of how the public respond to institutional representations of for instance, in this case, food poverty. So I would really like to do that at some point, sort of time and money permitting. And alternative data sets are out there as well. So obviously we're focusing on newspaper as a form of public discourse, but there are also a variety of really interesting other data sets that provide maybe a different perspective on this issue. So for instance, the Food Foundation have a platform called Breadline Voices where people share their experiences of food poverty, and I think there could be some really interesting comparisons between a corpus of that type of data versus UK newspaper representations as sort of institutional texts. I think that's pretty much it today for everything that I have to say. There's so much more to say about this, but I'll leave it there. And I just want to finish again by thanking Kevin and Maria, who have done an unbelievable amount of work on this. And they absolutely need to be credited, because I won't be talking if it wasn't for their hard work. So I think that's it, Richard. So if anyone's got any questions, that would be fantastic.
Well, yeah. Well, first you get a round of applause. Very nicely done. Yeah. That was great. Very stimulating, very topical, a bit sad, a bit scary, but very important research. Also like how you throw the whole toolbox of corpus techniques to answer that research question. Very nicely done. Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of questions. The first question comes from Mybrid.
Yeah, I have in your data because your results seem quite uniform. But of course you have, are they actually as uniform as they seem? Because you have left-leaning papers, centrist papers, and right-leaning papers. Are the patterns substantially?
That is the next thing that I would want to do, genuinely, is to look at how this works in terms of, I'll just go back to actually the slide, the distribution of the papers. I don't know if you can see that now. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the likelihood is that right-wing, traditionally right-wing papers probably don't report on this as much, and therefore you are going to invariably have more left-leaning papers, and they're more likely to have a specific outlook on it. I think you're absolutely right. I think this is something to be aware of in this data set, and I think it's mainly a consequence of the amount of data, and that's why I've been very cautious about the conclusions I want to make ultimately with this, because this has been an intentionally very eclectic data set, and it's also a pilot study. So there's a lot more that could be collected to even the data set out in terms of is there more right-leaning material out there, and actually does it even explicitly refer to food banks and food poverty, because there's the potential that our data collection processes for collecting the corpus is also probably quite narrow. You're looking at 3 mentions of food poverty, food banks, and there's the potential that there could be perhaps expressed in different ways, and that means that you don't overtly pick those articles up, perhaps in especially right-leaning papers as well. So yeah, there's definite a disproportionate distribution of the political leanings of the paper, which I do think, I think you're right, is probably responsible for some of the uniform results. But there's, as far as I'm aware, there's not been loads of evidence of sort of counter discourses to this. So when I'm talking about governments pushing and people being polled, that genuinely does seem to be the overall impression. And thus far anyway, you know, it's still early days. We've not really found any sort of counter discourses to that. I hope that kind of answers your question and where you was going with that, if that's okay.
I have a second question, which is for question detail. I was a bit puzzled by the fact that you classified to feel ashamed and to lose one's job as agentive, because they don't seem very agentive to me. And so what was the rationale for that?
Yeah, I think the reason why I've categorised them like that for now is that it's in the vast majority of cases when we get verbs in reference to people, they are the object of those verbs. So in most cases, people are being hit by these things. They're being pushed, they're being forced, they're being driven, or they're being left. I've just categorised them as agentive purely because this is something that people seem to be experiencing of their own accord. I absolutely agree that it's as a result of something that's beyond their control, but it's something that people are experiencing directly, if that makes sense. So it's kind of it's agentive in a passive way, but immediately I've just sort of categorised them to highlight the differences between the really passive processes, which is being hit with food poverty, versus feeling shame as a result of that, if that makes sense. But they're more closely related than I've perhaps indicated there.
You could call it agent and or experiencer or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is why we share these things, and people, you know, give you ideas and more fine-grained ways of identifying these patterns. But yeah, no, thank you. That's a really good point. Yeah.
I also had a comment on the first question, I think. One interesting step, I think, to maybe answer the question if there's a difference between the different political ideologies and the question of if food security discourses have increased, is to sort of normalize the number of articles that have these three keywords. I don't know, maybe the weather or articles on the stock market, something that happens regularly and where you wouldn't expect the frequency to share, and then express it as a percentage of it. Or maybe you have access to the overall length of the newspapers, and you could see if you know, just as a first question, perhaps discourses on food poverty have increased or decreased at all. I mean, it's very obvious that they have increased, but that would give you statistics where you could actually show it very clearly, I think. So that also relates to what Maybrit said in terms of how often do they actually appear, and why are they less frequent in right-wing newspapers? That's
of course.
A step, I think, to answer that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if there are other questions. Colin, please.
How do you go about compiling it? Like, how do you get it into a format that you can use it? Do you just copy and paste from websites, or how do you get the text into the format that you can use it?
Yeah, I'll be completely honest with you. I've credited Kevin Gergic, and that's because he's done all the corpus collection for me. He's worked with Nexus UK to extract the data out, but he's done the technical side of it, I'll be quite honest. So he's compiled the corpus for me, but as far as I'm aware, I think that's been quite a labour intensive process. So I do think there's been a lot of working with the raw data and copying and making that in a readable, you know, raw text format, if that makes sense. So I'm probably not the right person to ask about the technicalities of it, but Kevin's handled that, and it's really easy to use and straightforward. Having him done the work, so I can definitely ask him about that if that's something you're interested in. So I'm sorry I can't provide a bit more information about that at the moment.
No problem. And then the other question was about reuse. Like, can you can you now distribute this freely? Are there copyright restrictions on what you?
Yeah, it's all publicly available data, and none of Nexus UK doesn't search behind paywalls, I don't think. So everything that's been collected can be freely usable, and it will actually, the data set will be made available on, because this project has been funded through Aston University when I was there before I moved over to Manchester. It should be available on Aston have a forensic linguistic data bank. So this will it's a bit of an odd place for it to be hosted, but that will be freely usable for other researchers on there, because the data has been publicly available. So if anyone wanted to work with it, it'd be there to use.
Right. Yeah, very good. I want that corpus. Maybe I can ask one more question. At some point you said that at one extreme end of the spectrum, there is denial of food poverty in the UK altogether. Did you investigate this closer, and do you have some examples? And then the second question is, what is the dimension? I mean, it's such a complex problem, right? You have the different political ideologies, you have all these different terms, but then there's this one dimension where denial is in one extreme. So what is that scale? What is that dimension?
Yeah, I mean, I'll show you, that was in reference to some existing linguistic research on poverty, generally speaking. And this was, so this is research that's looked at poverty, not specifically food poverty, but as the overall sort of findings of that has pointed to discourses of neoliberal evaluations and flawed consumerism. But the denial of UK poverty from Patterson's paper there, that is particularly in relation to the electronic supplement analysis that I was talking about. So what she looked at was articles regarding recipients of benefits in the UK. So used a variety of different, I think there was a variety of different papers, but one that springs to mind was the Daily Mail, I'll be honest. And then using electronic supplement analysis, which is comparing the articles to the comments. That's where she found at the extreme end was people saying, let's say an article was about food poverty, for instance, or people's inability to pay bills. What she found in the responses is that people saying we don't have a poverty problem in this country because people can afford to turn the lights on and eat, and it's very often put in the context of global poverty, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about denial, it's very much British commenters contextualising British forms of poverty in a global scale and saying, therefore, we don't have a problem. People, in the grand scheme of things, we don't have any problems, and also people prioritise the wrong thing. So we're talking about flawed consumerism, which is just above there. People are only poor because they decide that they want to pay the Sky bills before they pay their water bills, for instance. So the denial is very much about if it's even a thing, can we even justifiably say that we experience poverty in this country? If that makes sense. Interestingly, what I would say so far is that I'm finding something very different here, is that people, or at least the representations in the data we've got, are very sympathetic of people experiencing food poverty in comparison to Patterson's data, which found that people, commenters on newspaper articles, are resistant to the idea of people experiencing poverty more generally in the UK. So I'm trying to distinguish whether there's actually a difference between food poverty and fuel poverty as sort of essentials and poverty more generally, if that makes sense. It's a very particular discourse, and I think it is very extreme, but I'm yet to find that in my data, if that makes sense.
Well, if I were to analyze this data along this dimension, I'd probably have downplaying on the one end and sort of exaggerating on the other, and the extreme end would be denial. But then it also mixes it with what could perhaps be called the moral dimension. You know, what you said, the deserving, undeserving, and the three boxes that I see here sort of merge the two: exaggeration or downplaying and moral issues or deserving, stuff like this. So maybe it can be separated out into two different.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is kind of the good and the bad problem having this type of data, is that there's lots you can do with it. And it's really interesting. It's kind of doing it in a realistic and manageable way so you can focus on the right things at the right time. So that's definitely something that I'd want to look at if there was a scale of exaggeration and downplaying, definitely.
Well, Leigh, then thanks once again. It's a big shame you can't be here, but hopefully soon we can socialize again. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Let's thank our speaker once again.
Thank you.
And yeah, see you around. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. See you later, everyone. Bye.